Good morning. If you have your Bibles with you, would you turn to Matthew chapter 22? This morning we're going to look at verse 36 through 40. Matthew 22, verse 36 through 40. If you don't have your Bibles, you can look up on the screen here. Verse 36 says this, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments." If we look at chapter 22 in a more greater or in a macro level, if we look at it in a large picture, what you see happening in verse 22 is these religious leaders, they come to question Jesus. In some ways, I think they use the language to trap Jesus. They want to bring something, a question or something, get his opinion about something, so that they can use that to entrap him. For example, verse 15, 16, 17, they want to know what his thought is about paying taxes. They ask, Jesus, basically they're saying, should we pay taxes? Who should we pay taxes to? Or should we pay taxes? And in another time, in verse 23, they want to know what Jesus' thought is about the resurrection. What is your thought about resurrection? Because the Sadducees, I believe, they do not believe in the resurrection. So they wanted to get Jesus' understanding or his thoughts on the resurrection. Once again, if he sides with them, if he agrees with them, they can use that to what? Go back to the Pharisees or others who believed in resurrection and say, "Hey, did you hear Jesus just say?" So with all of these things, they're coming at him in chapter 22 with these various questions. And we come to verse 36. A teacher in the law, an expert actually in the law, comes and asks Jesus this question: what is the greatest commandment in the law of Moses? Now, I don't know what your thoughts are when you hear this laws of Moses. Maybe you kind of think about the 10 Commandments. What is the greatest commandment among the 10 Commandments? Dr. Stephen Davey from Wisdom for Heart Ministries, he writes a very interesting background about how difficult this question actually is. Which one is the greatest commandment in the law of Moses? He says, over the years, the rabbis had supposedly determined, just as there were 613 separate letters in the Hebrew text of the 10 Commandments, so also were there 613 separate laws in the Pentateuch, which are the 5 books of Moses. When they look at the 10 Commandments, they determine that there are 613 letters in the commandments. Just like that, when they looked at the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, they also concluded, they counted 613 laws. Furthermore, the laws were divided into heavy and light. The heavy ones were absolutely binding, and the light ones were less binding. They had never been unanimous as to which laws were heavy and which were light. So the rabbis and the scribes, they spent countless hours proudly debating the merits of their particular divisions and rankings of the laws within the division. 613 laws. Not only did they consider them to be heavy and light, they also divided them into 2 groups, affirmative and negative groups. They held that 247 of the 613 laws were affirmative laws, one for every part of the human body as they knew it. And 365 were considered to be negative laws, one for each day of the year. They looked at the Pentateuch, said there are 613 laws, and we're going to divide it and categorize it into affirmative and negative. We're going to say some of these are heavy and some of these are light. But there was no agreement on those. And so that's what they spent a lot of their time, studying the word, debating with one another. So when they come to Jesus and say, which one of the laws of Moses is the greatest, is the top, is the highest, ultimate law? We see it's a very loaded question. Jesus picked one out of the 613 and tell us which one is the greatest or the ultimate. We have to understand the motive behind the questions. So every time we see that, I think about 3 examples in chapter 22. The goal is to trap Jesus. The goal is to test him. And so when the Pharisee comes and says, hey, when this expert in the law comes and says, what is the greatest or the ultimate law among the 613? They're looking for that one thing that Jesus would speak about, that they could turn around and use against him. Jesus responded in verse 37, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. You know, Jesus reveals what the greatest commandment is. And I think for each one of us here this morning, I think it's a good advice for us to study it, to be familiar with it, and to follow it. But before we kind of dive into and unpack this verse, there's something here that kind of presets this statement. Because we're being told to love God. But in order, when we are called to love God, there is another element that, although it's not directly applied or implied here, or stated here, I think there is an implication here. Meaning that it's because we are to love God because God loved us first. Does that make sense? When we look at this greatest commandment, we're commanded to love God, but in that statement, there's a truth, which is God loved us. And how do we know that? We see the examples in the scriptures. This morning, I want us to kind of be reminded once again about God's love. Because I think we have to understand that before we can really apply this commandment or these 2 commandments into our lives. So first thing we want to discuss this morning is that God's love is amazing, but we often forget that we don't deserve it. God's love is amazing, but often we forget that we don't deserve it. Romans 5:8 says that, but God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. I am blown away when I actually think about Romans 5:8. That before anything, before I did anything, while I was still a sinner, God sent his son Jesus to die on the cross for me. That is the essence of the gospel message, isn't it? That God sent his son for you and I before we were even born. Just think about that. Just let that soak in for a moment. Not just before we were sinners. Not while we were still sinners, but before you and I were even born. That's the beauty of the sacrificial love of God. And like maybe some of you and I, we have been wrecked by that love, haven't we? What I mean by that is, it just even in the last couple of days, as I was just meditating on this a little bit more, it's really amazing. Because there's such a challenge in our day and age to really love. And yet, many times when our love for people, our love in general, it tends to fluctuate. Sometimes based upon what we get. If our love is not reciprocated, forget them, or forget him, or forget her. The level of our love fluctuates. But God loved us so much that while we were still sinners, he sent his son Jesus to die for us before we were born. That is an incredible truth. And it's a really humbling thing for me, when I really reflect on that. I think it's unfortunate that we forget about God's amazing love, though. Too often we're not grateful. We go about our daily lives as if nothing has happened. We forget where we came from. Something is a little bit off in how you and I live. And one of the things that I believe that poses a challenge to understanding or acknowledging God's love is this sense of entitlement. Unfortunately, this sense of entitlement is all around us. You know, they call the millennials, right? The millennials, some of you are millennials, don't be offended. They say one of the negative attributes of millennials in our time, in our generation, is that they have this sense of entitlement. You see, a sense of entitlement, it prevents people from saying thank you. Why would you say thank you if you feel that you have a sense of entitlement to whatever just happened, right? A sense of entitlement, it leads to self-centeredness. A selfish generation. It's difficult for a person, or for this person, to care for or think about another person. An entitled person wants to be served, not serve. Sense of entitlement is all around us. It affects our interpersonal relationships, but it also affects our relationship with God. We take things for granted. We expect God to meet our needs, our goals, our preferences, and meet it when we need it, when we want it. We forget about grace. Why? Because we feel like we deserve it. See, the sense of entitlement kind of gives this idea of it's rightfully mine, or it's a privilege that I have. Okay, it's we don't think anything of it. We're like, oh, well, naturally. I mean, of course, it should be this way. And my wife and I, we try our best not to spoil our kids, but it's a challenge. Because I think it really does stem from the fact that when I was younger, there was a lot of things I never got. My son has more Legos than I ever owned in my life. Actually, I never owned Legos in my life. My family, we could not afford that. So I want to provide for them for things that they, that I couldn't have. So it comes out of that love, but man, it's so hard because they get the sense of entitlement. Like, oh, it's natural. Of course I'll get what I want. No, you guys don't get it. You get it because mom and dad love you. And so this sense of entitlement is all around us, and I believe it's what prevents us from really understanding and reflecting on God's love. Be reminded this morning of God's amazing love. Understanding God's love will enable us actually to follow what Jesus is saying here, which is to love God and love others. Jesus says to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So when we understand God's love, okay, kind of have a refresher on understanding what God's love is, or what God's love is like. God's love for us then, it elicits a response of love and devotion. Okay, so when we understand, so we know God loves us. God's love then, it causes us to respond with love and devotion. And I put those two together. I don't just say it causes us to just love, but I feel that the second element, devotion, is equally important. You can't have one or the other, but both of them together, I think, is what Jesus is stating here. Love God and be devoted to Him. Devotion, according to the dictionary, is a feeling of strong love or loyalty. Okay, a feeling of strong love or loyalty, either for a person, an activity, or a cause. Okay, that's devotion. We use the term also for religious worship or observances. We say devotions, usually a plural. Okay, religious worship or observances. How do you show devotion to God? How do you show God that you are devoted to Him? Well, you do your devotions, meaning you read the Bible, you meditate on Scripture, you pray. That's one of the ways that we show our devotion to Him, is to engage in the Word and to pray daily. Not because it's a ritual, but it's because that is something that helps us to build a relationship with God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind. If you look at this passage from Mark, I think Mark chapter 12, it adds, I think, all your strength as well. In Mark's gospel, we see the four elements. Basically, when we're talking about heart and soul and mind, nothing is left out here. Love God with your everything, basically. And excuse me. And the word love that we see is an agape love. Agape love, as you know, is very different than the other forms of love that we see in the Greek language. It's not a friendly love or brotherly love or romantic. Agape love is very different. And I found this definition this week. Unconditional love that is always giving and impossible to take or be a taker. It devotes total commitment to seek your highest best, no matter how anyone may respond. This form of love is totally selfless. It does not change whether the love given is returned or not. A selfless love. A love that does not change whether the love is given is returned or not. That's agape love. A selfless love. An unconditional love. That is what Jesus is saying. Love God unconditionally. Love God selflessly. With your all. Heart, soul, mind, strength. It's great for us to have an example on the other side, so we know what not to do. And the person who comes to ask the question, the Pharisee, provides that example for us. The Pharisees, one thing that we know about them is that they were devoted, weren't they? They were devoted to God in many ways. That's why I say God's love, it causes us or elicits in us the response of love and devotion, not just devotion. They were devoted to a cause, which was to live righteously. And they followed the rules, 613 laws. And they broke those down and said, you know what, this is what I think God meant. And just, in many ways, it just avalanched from there. They were devoted, but they lacked one thing. They lacked love. The Billy Graham Ministries has a magazine called Decision. In that, I was reading through one of the articles, and an author kind of wrote about this section of the passage that we just looked at. And he says this: the Pharisees prided themselves on meticulous observance of the law. They not only knew the Ten Commandments, but they paid rigorous attention to all the laws in the book of Moses, 613 laws according to traditional count. They tried to reason out the implications of the law and to make sure that they avoided even the possibility of violating any of them. But the Pharisees had lost sight of the very heart of the matter, loving God. Without love for God, the external observance of the commandments becomes an empty form. They were devoted, but they did not have love. They knew God loved them, but in order to live righteous, for the righteousness, they devoted themselves to the word, to follow the laws, but they were driven by the fear of not violating or breaking the law. They failed on so many accounts. They didn't love. That was one element that they missed. There are people who are devoted to God. They will do all of these things. And yet they fail to do what Jesus says here, which is what? The greatest commandment, the ultimate commandment is to love God with that agape love. We respond to God's love by loving God, by our devotion to Him. We understand God's love. We're called to love God and be devoted to Him. And lastly this morning, God's love compels us to love other people. Jesus says the second command is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And He kind of sums it up and says all of the laws and the prophets, they are wrapped up or they're all the laws and the commandments, demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. These two laws basically sums up all of the teachings, is what Jesus is saying. Love your neighbor as yourself. Does God expect me to love everyone? Is that even possible? I'm sure God doesn't mean that I have to love the person who is so annoying, like my annoying neighbor. Do I have to love my coworker who takes all the credit for my work? Do I have to love the person who is the source of all the gossip about me? Do I have to love the person that always wants to copy my homework in class? Do I have to love the person who, I don't know, just fill in the blanks? Do I have to love the person that hates me? Do I have to love the person that's out to kill me? Do I have to love the people that are persecuting me? I read an article. It's one of those things that really disturbs you. There was a guy, a young boy, maybe early teens. He was bullied so much at school, but he had special needs. He was deaf, and kids were bullying him so much that I think, school has just started, right? So within the first couple weeks of school, the picture that I saw was a toilet that's filled with all of his stuff in his backpack. And the article went on to say how that was the last straw for him and his family. His parents pulled him out of school and placed him into a school, a different school. And you look at this and you wonder, what's the administrators of the school? What are they doing? This is a student with special needs attending a public school. So you would think that there would be greater care and attention given to him. But the bullying and the teasing and things like that just continues for so long that ultimately it culminated in this. I saw a commercial where a kid is getting bullied left and right and left and right. And then as that's going on, they flash these words: bullying kills. And you see him going through all of these things, being made fun of, laughed, and teased. And at the end of the video clip, you see him, he's holding something. Basically, he's holding a noose. And you see from a distance, from a tree, he commits suicide. And the message is stop bullying. When I was a youth pastor, I had youth students who were bullied at school. It's happening today. We hear stories of, it's not just for high school kids. I mean, even older people, we face that as well. Even people who do wrong, even people who are responsible for those things, we have to love them. Let's be honest, this is not an easy thing to do. Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay. Love those who persecute you. Love those who hate you. Love those who want to kill you. It becomes more challenging. The question for us this morning is not, do I have to love my neighbor? That is not the question. But the question is, how can I love my neighbor? You see, there is no debate on that. We are commanded to love our neighbor. So we should all understand that, we are called to love our neighbor. So the question is not, do I? But the question is, how can I? How can I love? How do I love the difficult people? How do I love them? We are expected to love God, and we are expected to love others. So I ask this question once again. How can we love others? How can we love our neighbor? Good thing for you this morning, I have the answer. One answer. We're going to live out this second commandment by going to the Oregon Food Bank on October 8th. I feel like I needed to speak I feel like I needed to make a connection of what we're trying to do with what God commands. And this week, we just happened to come to this passage. Oregon Food Bank, October 8th, 9 a.m. We have an opportunity to serve the poor in our community. I don't know how much you know about this demographics of our church here. The fact that we are here in Beaverton, I've mentioned this many times, Northwest Beaverton, this is a very nice area. If you just go north of our church a little bit and go into the communities, neighborhoods, the homes are very nice. And just down the street in Walker Road, Waterhouse communities. I remember when those things were first built. It was a very, very nice neighborhood. Very nice homes. So our church is placed in this very interesting, typical upper middle class or middle class suburb. But then why is the food bank 5 minutes from our church? Why did they have that, the western location or west side location? Why is that here? And when you start looking at the demographics of this neighborhood, not just the Waterhouse homes and the homes right near our church, but when you go a little bit further out, then I think you begin to see a different picture. And I was kind of shocked at some of the statistics that I found. The 2015 federal poverty level for a household of 4 people. Okay? So the federal government says that below this income for a family of 4, we consider you to be living at the poverty level. That amount was $24,250. That's the 2015 number. Okay, a family of 4. If you have $24,250 a year, if you make less than that, you are at the federal poverty level. The Oregon Food Bank did a survey, I think it was last year, where they looked at all the people that are coming to the food pantry, which is basically their offices. And they did a survey. 72% of the people that are coming fell below that poverty line. 72% of the people that were coming to the pantry fell below that poverty line. They didn't reveal how many people they did the survey, but on a given week, they have thousands of people that come. So there's thousands of people in our communities that are living below this line. It's $24,000 a year for a family of 4. It's tough. This next one actually really shocked me. Oregon has one of the highest rates of childhood hunger in the U.S. Especially alarming considering our incredible bounty of agricultural production. Large number of youth rely heavily on school meals for their daily food needs. During weekends, school holidays, and summer, too many youth and their families are struggling to find enough food. My sister has a friend who teaches at one of the schools in Beaverton, elementary school. She told my sister that 97% of the students in her school are at reduced lunch. 97% of students in that elementary school, in Beaverton School District, were at reduced lunch. 97%. That's the entire school. So because the percentage was so high, they just, at that school, this was last year, I don't know about this year, but last year they just said, we're going to give free food to everybody, breakfast and lunch. Because 97% of the population needed it anyways. This is happening in America. This is happening in our own communities. It's easy for us, because we have been so blessed, to really be somewhat oblivious or out of touch with the needs. There's a reason why you see so many people asking for help, almost at every intersection throughout the city. I know that Portland draws a lot of homeless youth. That's been the case for generations, or many, many years. But what has the church? What have we done about it? There's a huge need in our city. It's not just in Portland, but I'm telling you, in Beaverton. I find it very interesting that the food bank is just down the street from our church. That means there's a need in this community. Although we are surrounded by nice homes, new developments, I don't think you have to go very far to see people who are living, who are faced with some challenges in their daily lives. There are people struggling with hunger and poverty in our community. How can we serve? How can we love our neighbors? This is one way. You know what? You can do something about it. We're going to be going to a food bank. What we will be basically doing is when they get donations, it comes in bulk, huge bulks. And what we're going to be doing is basically repackaging food into smaller portions so that it can be distributed to families that have need. I'm not asking for any of your money, but I am asking for your time. In some way, time in these kind of things is much more difficult to give. Sometimes it's like just pull out some money and give it. It's easier. But time, 2.5 hours. So it's October 8th, 9 a.m., Oregon Food Bank. I think this session is going to go for about 2.5 hours or so. You have an opportunity to serve and live out the gospel. Sure, you don't have a direct contact with people who will be receiving the food, but this is just one way for us that we can serve, to follow God's command, to love God with all our all, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. I hope you will sign up, and I hope that you will go in October 8th to go and live out this command by loving our neighbors. We have about 3 weeks to go. I've reserved 25 spots. I hope we fill that up. And then some. And then ask them, hey, can we bring more people? But this is just one simple way that we can love our neighbors.